All right, Crim 28, let's knock out Chapter 10, Economic and Restorative Justice Reparations. Again, I think they purposefully made the titles of the chapters sound particularly boring. But let's make the chapter not be that boring. Learning objectives, blah, blah, blah. Introduction, community justice versus restorative justice. So, community justice philosophy that uses community stakeholders to control and reduce crime and rebuild community relationships through community policing, community courts, and restorative justice. This is something that has become rather popular. Actually, it was really popular decades, centuries ago, and it has kind of popped up again in our communities more recently for a lot of different reasons. And restorative justice is something else that is, again, really common. We're using it a lot right now in our communities for a lot of different reasons, and I'm a little bit jaded. I've worked in the system for a long time, and I'm going to personally say I think the main reason we use a lot of these types of programs right now is because, honestly, in my opinion, we don't have the bed space to lock people up anymore. So we have to try all kinds of interesting other ideas and ways to hold people accountable and repair relationships between victims and offenders, because we can't lock everybody up forever. So trying to figure out other creative ways to repair relationships and make people whole again, which is one of the really main focuses and goals of restorative justice and community justice. We want the community to heal from whatever has gone on, from the negative behavior, from the illegal behaviors. So what we want to do is emphasize the offender and the victim and the community all working together to resolve the issues, as opposed to just throwing an offender in jail and saying, okay, we're done with you, move on to the next thing. So we want to have the offenders and victims and community work together to come up with a plan to resolve the problem. And what we do, restorative justice is kind of a big deal in Fresno County. It is run through Fresno Pacific University. They have a graduate program there that deals with peacekeeping and mediation, and they run the restorative justice program in Fresno County. And what they do is have mediators that work with victims and offenders, and they try and resolve kind of lower level criminal behaviors. And in a perfect world, restorative justice is a great idea. And in certain cases, restorative justice has been fabulous and has really helped to rebuild communities, rebuild relationships. Unfortunately, we all know we don't live in a perfect world. And so in certain instances, restorative justice has been just amazing. Anyway, so it's based on Native American culture, where ultimately what used to happen is if there was a wrong done by someone in the Native American culture, the elders would sit in a circle along with the rest of the tribe, and they would all discuss, along with the offender and the victim, the offense and what should happen to the offender and how they could resolve the issue. The focus is on the offender, the victim, and the community, as opposed to just punishing the offender. So the offender would have to actually face the victim and explain why they did what they did. The victim, the community, got to express how they felt about what happened, as opposed to the victim the offender just being shamed by being thrown into custody. And they were able to repair the bonds that were broken by that criminal behavior. So all forms of restorative justice share 6 commonalities. Typically victim and offender volunteer to participate. At least one session is held within the community. There's usually a plan that's accepted by both the victim and the offender. There's typically a volunteer of some sort that is working with the victim and the offender. Now, typically that's going to be the mediator. Offenders have to accept responsibility for the crime and admit guilt. If the offender does not admit guilt, then there is no restorative justice. And it can take place in custody, but for the most part, these are programs that take place in lieu of or instead of an offender actually going to court. Okay, so in the juvenile world where I worked for the majority of my career, we did a lot of the restorative justice because a lot of the offenses that we had, more to choose from, more first-time low-level offenders to choose from. So procedural justice, on the other hand, this is also kind of a concept that allows for the offender to feel like they have been treated fairly. And if they feel like they've been treated fairly, they're more likely to comply with the expectation of the courts. So when you have something like restorative justice, when you have something where the victim, offender, and community are all involved in the outcome of the treatment of the victim and the offender, everybody can get on board and maybe be more at peace with the resolution of the crime, with the resolution with how everyone agreed to resolve whatever that particular issue is. So, moving on. Again, victim and offender mediation. This is also very common, a portion of restorative justice where the victim and offender meet along with a mediator. It's been around since the early 1980s. This is something that is agreed upon by both parties. Typically, the victim and the offender are both going to discuss the incident, the crime, the criminal behavior. They're going to talk about how the victim can make the offender whole, whether that's by paying restitution, by whether that's by writing a letter saying that they're sorry, whether that's going to be just admitting that what they did was wrong, whatever that is, and the victim and offender come together and resolve the issue through mediation. Sentencing circles, same kind of deal, consist of the offender, victim, family, all kinds of people. Of all restorative justice programs, sentencing circles involve the largest number of participants and are the most organized. But these are very similar. Sentencing circles, if you could think back to hundreds of years ago when the Native Americans would have sat in circles, maybe around the campfire or the fire, they would have discussed between all of them the nature of the offense, how the victim felt, how the offender felt, how the community felt, and they would all have input on what should happen as a result of the crime. Reparations boards, again, we're talking about a group of people whose job it is to decide how to make the victim whole. And those of you who either do work in the criminal justice system or plan to work in the criminal justice system, it is an unfortunate fact that you, unfortunately or sadly, will probably realize that the victims sadly get left behind and forgotten many times, too many times in the criminal justice system. We're also worried about making sure that the offender is supervised and is punished and is rehabilitated and this, that, and the other, that we kind of sometimes forget about trying to repair the victim or make the victim whole. There are reparation boards. There are victim advocates. There are people that work in the criminal justice system that are specifically there to work with victims. There are just not enough of them. So, but that's what the entire purpose of a reparation board is, to make the victims whole. Victim impact panels, again, there are people. The Fresno County Probation Department has an entire division that's just victim. Oh gosh, what are they called? I can't even remember. Victim advocates. Victim advocates. It's not a large group, and they don't get paid very well, and they do very difficult work working with victims all day, every day, to try and provide services for victims, whether that be making sure that the defendants are making their restitution payments, whether it's trying to find them counseling services, whether it's trying to help them pay their bills because they lost their job because they had to go to court so many times because they were victimized. So victim impact panels, these people don't necessarily have to be the victims of that particular offender, but these are people who represent victims in general so that the offenders can have an understanding of how their behaviors have impacted the community and the victim as a whole. How effective is restorative justice? Studies show restitution is more likely to actually happen as part of restorative justice than traditional court processing. I believe this to be true. I can say if I had a case on regular old standard probation versus restorative justice, in my experience, I would say someone on restorative justice type of probation was probably more likely to pay their restitution than a standard probation case. Less likely to be accepted by victims of violent crimes. Oof, that's sad. There's just some other statistics. Evaluations. Juvenile offenders seem to do well. Restitution. Restitution and retribution are two different things. Restitution is a court-ordered payment by the offender to the victim or the victim's family to cover tangible losses. Okay, so if I smashed your car windshield in and I got busted, caught for it, I'd have to pay to fix your car windshield. Has a long history around the world, of course. Now, do we ever actually see that money? That's the next question. Victim rights movement in the 1960s put a spotlight on the need for judges to order restitution. This is a really tricky one, and we're going to talk more about that as we continue with these slides, and it does get very frustrating as a probation officer, parole agent, any of that kind of stuff. To actually get money out of offenders is a whole other question, because most of the time these offenders, number one, don't have money, or number two, aren't going to pay the money. But this is, we'll get to that. There are different, let me go back, sorry. I said retribution and restitution. It's important that you know the difference, because it might be something I might ask you, but retribution is the whole concept of vengeance, or an eye for an eye. It's more of a concept of punishment, whereas restitution is basically paying a victim back for something that you have destroyed, stolen, taken from them, something like that. So, and it's typically a court-ordered payment. So a lot of people will get confused about restitution. There's typically a couple of different kinds of restitution. There are restitution fines, and then there is victim restitution. There are things in California specifically that are restitution fines. So anyone who's convicted of any crime, but a misdemeanor or felony in California, has to pay a restitution fine. Restitution fines go into what something's called a restitution fund. And that is a fund, F-U-N-D, not a fund, but a fund that goes to all victims. So any victim of violent crime has access to that money. And then victim restitution is different. Now, and let me back up. There are violent crimes that take place every day in Fresno, let's say. Obviously, we're talking about our discussion question from this week. Every single day, and many of those violent crimes are never solved. That does not mean that those victims don't have any access to that victim restitution fund. So all of those fines, restitution fines, are going to the victim restitution fund. Victims of violent crime where the suspect was not located have access to those funds. Okay. Victim restitution that's specific to the victim of of a particular crime. So I'm probably confusing the crap out of you right now because I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't know. So let's say again, I was arrested for smashing in a car window, and they caught me, and they charged me with a felony because it was a really expensive car. So I was ordered to pay a $1,000 restitution fine because it was a felony, and everybody who's convicted of a felony has to pay that $1,000 fine. And I had to pay victim restitution to John Smith because I smashed in his car windshield, and that was $1,500. I had to pay victim restitution to John Smith in the amount of $1,500. I had to pay a restitution fine in the amount of $1,000 because I committed a felony. That makes sense? There's two different kinds of restitution there. One, I'm paying specifically to my victim, and one, I'm paying to the restitution fund just because I committed a felony. I hope that makes sense. All right. So, victims have been forgotten, and there has been a movement in Washington to try to get get the victims more compensation. And these are other parties who are eligible. I'm not going to read them to you. Problems with restitution. There are a lot. Trust me, I've been there. Underutilization. People don't know that they're eligible for restitution. That's unfortunately victims don't know. It's very sad, and I can say wholeheartedly that I, as a probation officer, should have been better about telling victims what they were eligible for. It is unfortunate that you just get so busy when you could literally have hundreds and thousands of people that you supervise on probation or parole, that it gets overwhelming, and sometimes you're so busy putting out fires, not literally, but figuratively, that you prioritize, and unfortunately the victims sometimes ended up at the bottom of the list. And it's wrong, and I know that in so many ways, but that's unfortunately what happened. The lack of victim participation in the system and knowledge. The defendant's indigence, meaning they didn't have any money. So you have, like they say, you can't get blood out of a tomato. I think that's the phrase. I hope that's the phrase. You can't get blood out of a tomato. Yeah, if they don't have any money, then how are you going to get money out of them? Or if they're in prison and they're making 25 cents a day or an hour working at the commissary at the prison. Determining the proper amount. This is tough too, because unfortunately people will sometimes lie. I know it's shocking, but sometimes people lie. So that's tough also. And then collecting restitution. So it's very difficult to do this too, because as a probation officer, I don't want them giving me money. I don't want their money. So that's another challenge. Indigent offenders, as you can imagine, a lot of people on probation don't have a lot of money. I had a case, and I hope I didn't tell you guys this story before, about the young man who shot a little old man's horses. He probably had, I don't know, 10-ish horses, and he shot them all in the head and killed them all. And it was well over $100,000 that the young man owed in restitution. I couldn't prove that the young man who turned 18 while he was on probation, I couldn't prove that he had the money to pay. So I couldn't violate his probations. It's very, very, very difficult to prove that a person has money when they don't. And then even if they declare bankruptcy, it's a big mess. And it's very frustrating as a probation officer or parole agent to tell the victim, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. I can't violate his probation or parole. You need to sue him in civil court. Bankruptcy does not excuse them from restitution, but it still doesn't mean that the probation officer or parole agent can arrest them because they haven't paid restitution, which really stinks. Determining restitution amount, pretty tough. Anyways, here's a bunch of information. Judge sets the amount typically. It's really hard. It's very hard to get people, victims, to get you very specific information also about how much they owe or how much an item was worth that was stolen. The probation business office used to collect the restitution payments, but like I said, very few people actually paid restitution. Only about a third to half of felony offenders paid full restitution. That number is shocking to me. I would guarantee, just about guarantee, it's a lot lower than that. Some systems will not incarcerate an offender if restitution is not paid. That's the case here in California. So, community service. What is community service? You probably all heard about it before. Some of you may have had to do it for other reasons, not because you were in trouble, but because you wanted a scholarship, or it would look good on a college application or whatever. But it is the unpaid service to the public to compensate for harm done by the offender. It's very much so. When again, as a probation officer, many times people were ordered to complete community service. This again was something that was very difficult because a lot of times many of my clients were troubled, let's say. So then I would have to dump them on another agency and have another agency supervise my offender and make sure that they did some volunteer work. So yeah, they would have to do a certain number of hours. Every now and then I would have someone just shine in the place where they did community service, and they would end up getting a job, and so that was wonderful. But community service, basically you're volunteering, doing work to make up for the choices that you made. Probationers who were ordered fines, community service. So yeah, this is kind of a breakdown of fines, treatment, community service, and restitution. More positive things about community service. And I'm not saying anything if you're wondering, why is she quiet? You can read that. How effective is it? What is the purpose of community service? I also used to work on what was called the Community Service Work Program through probation with adults, and they had to pay to do community service. That was interesting. I cannot tell you how many times I got cussed out by people who were very upset that they had to pay to do community service. And they had one other fabulous option. I said, don't pay and go to jail instead. So they stopped cussing me out immediately and gladly went on to do their community service after I told them that. So anyways, fines. Fines have been a part of the judicial system for as long as the judicial system has been around. You can pay money and not be responsible anymore for your criminal behavior. Depends on typically how serious the offense is, and a lot of times, unfortunately or fortunately, how much you can afford. Fines are underused in their collection and not well enforced. Probation cannot be revoked solely due to an offender's inability to pay a fine or restitution. Yep, I know this because I tried it. It did not work. If you're unwilling and I can prove that you just don't want to pay it, that's a different story. But trying to prove, that's... Whew. Fees also, and another wonderful thing, as an adult, if you're on adult probation, probably parole as well, you have to pay to be drug tested. You have to pay for your monthly supervision fees too. So, yeah, there is DNA testing, drug testing, all this kind of stuff. Court costs. It is very expensive to be a criminal, although most criminals don't pay any of these fees, so it probably doesn't really matter. Forfeitures. All right, this is another good one. And I had some students in one class get really upset one time when I said this, that yeah, police are allowed to confiscate anything that was purchased, that they can prove was purchased by money that was obtained through illegal sources. So like, you know, if it was drug money, then if a Lamborghini was purchased with drug money and the cops can prove it, then that Lamborghini belongs to the police agency. I mean, yeah. So I remember having a group of students that were really upset by that, which I thought was kind of funny, because there were all kinds of other things that they weren't upset about, but that was really upsetting to them. But anyways, yeah, if you have a lot of money laying around your house that's drug money and the police can prove that that's drug money, that money is going to the police department. That's what forfeiture is. So anyways, and you can also, of course, read this slide. But yes, it does happen. Fresno County Probation has a drug detection canine. His name is Ace. And whenever he finds drugs and or drug money, the Fresno County Probation Department does get a portion of that money. Is that fair? I don't know. I think it is. They paid a lot of money for that dog, and he found that money. I mean, it's very specific what they can and cannot do with that money. They can't go out and have a party. And there was an instance where a DA's office, not locally, a DA's office somewhere in the United States, it was not Fresno, so don't worry. But a DA's office went out and bought a margarita machine with their forfeiture money. So that did not fly. So anyways, that's what forfeiture is. And let's move on, and we're done. Okay, this is way too long. Sorry, guys.